By the time Sabine Ashcroft was led into the hall of red glass, the bells had already begun their mourning. They were not ringing for the dead. They were ringing in anticipation. The high windows of Vesper Keep burned with the light of a swollen crimson moon, staining the marble floor with the color of opened veins. Noblewomen stood along the aisle in gowns of pearl, silver, and ash, every face pale with dread. Their mothers held their shoulders too tightly. Their fathers stared at the carved pillars and pretended not to tremble. No one spoke above a whisper, not with the coven gathered upon the black dais, and Lord Lucan Vesper seated among them like a silence made flesh. Sabine had not been meant to stand with the daughters of noble houses. She had come only to fasten Lady Celia's cloak and keep her gloves from touching the floor. That was the place allowed to her in House Ashcroft, near enough to serve, never near enough to matter. Her aunt had made that clear from the year Sabine's mother died, and left her nameless but for pity. The keep's old servants knew Sabine by her gentleness, her careful hands, her habit of moving as though apology lived in her bones. The court knew her less kindly, the girl in the gray dress. The poor relation, the one no lord ever noticed, no mother ever praised, no suitor ever chose. Then Lady Celia saw the throne, and she refused. "I will not go to him," Celia whispered, her face blanching under powder. "I would rather die." "You will shame us," Lady Honoria hissed back. "I will die if I step before him." The hush deepened as the High Regent lifted her staff of white iron. "House Ashcroft," she said, her voice cold as chapel stone. "Present the daughter offered under covenant law." Celia stumbled backward. In that single terrified movement, Sabine's life was pushed forward and replaced. Lady Honoria turned. Her fingers closed on Sabine's wrist with cruel, practiced calm. "This one will do." For a moment, Sabine did not understand. She only stared. Her aunt's smile did not reach her eyes. "My late sister's child," she said to the regent, "unwed, of proper blood enough to satisfy the covenant." Sabine found her voice too late. "My lady, I was not. You were what was available," Lady Honoria murmured. "Be grateful someone finally chose you." There were quiet sounds from the gathered houses, then not outrage, only relief. Relief that the unwanted girl had become useful. Sabine felt the whole hall look through her, weigh her, discard her. She ought to have wept. Instead, she felt strangely hollow, as if humiliation had gone too deep to sting. Her hands were cold. Her breath came thin. Yet when the regent beckoned, Sabine walked. The dais rose before her like an altar built for surrender. Lord Lucan Vesper did not move as she approached. That was what struck her first. Not his beauty, though it was severe enough to wound. Not the darkness of his hair or the austere line of his mouth. Not even the old grief in his face, so disciplined it might have been mistaken for cruelty. It was his stillness that frightened her. He sat with one hand on the arm of his chair, black-clad, broad-shouldered, unadorned but for a silver chain at his throat. The room seemed to bend around that stillness. Men with swords looked lesser near him, candles trembled in his silence. Sabine stopped where the blood-red sigil had been painted on the floor. The regent spoke the ancient words of covenant law. "Under moon and witness, House Vesper shall take the offered bride to test the bond and satisfy the old hunger. If she survives, she is marked. If she dies, the law is fulfilled." A terrible murmur passed through the hall. Sabine looked up then, because she could not bear not to. Lucan Vesper's gaze had finally settled on her. It was not hunger she found there. It was absence, as though he had lived too long among ghosts and expected her to become one in moments. He descended the dais without a sound. When he stood before her, Sabine realized how very impossible it was that a man could seem both beautiful and ruinous. His skin was pale in the moonlight. A faint scar crossed his throat, disappearing beneath the collar of his coat. His eyes were dark enough to hold no mercy and no malice either, only exhaustion bound in iron. "You may withdraw," he said, his voice low. No one answered. The regent struck her staff once. "The law is spoken." Something changed in him then, not obedience precisely, but surrender to an old hatred. He took Sabine's hand. His touch was gloved, cool through the leather, and yet the contact moved through her like a remembered winter. She should have recoiled. She did not. She only lifted her chin because she had nothing else left to offer herself except dignity. "I am sorry," he said so quietly only she heard it. Then he bent his head. The first touch of his mouth to her throat was almost reverent. The bite was not. Pain split bright and white through her neck. The hall blurred. Someone gasped. Sabine's knees weakened under her, but Lucan's hand came to her waist. Not possessive, merely steady, holding her upright while death entered her in the sacred place beneath the ear. Yet death did not feel as she had imagined. It felt like a door striking open in darkness. Images flooded her. Veiled girls laid upon stone slabs, lips blue with poison, a silver sigil burning over a man's heart, blood turning black in crystal cups, Lucan kneeling alone in a chapel. His mouth red, his hands shaking with horror while the dead were carried away. She felt grief that was not hers, rage that was not hers, and beneath both, something deeper and more terrible, a hunger long chained, suddenly lifting its head. Lucan tore himself away. Sabine collapsed to the floor, the hall erupted. She should be dead. The wound, look, she's still breathing. Sabine pressed a hand to her throat. Blood warmed her palm. Her vision dimmed, then steadied. Above her, the crimson moon burned through the glass like an unwinking eye. Lucan stood over her, staring as if the world had shifted 1 degree off its axis. The regent descended the dais at last, her expression sharpened by alarm. "Finish it," she said. Lucan did not look at her. "She lives. No woman survives your bite. She does." The words seemed to strike the hall silent. The regent's fingers tightened around her staff. "Then something is wrong with her." Sabine should have been afraid of that sentence. Instead, she could think only of the vision, dead brides, poisoned mouths, Lucan kneeling in bloodlit grief. She lifted her eyes to him again, and this time there was no absence in his face. There was shock, and beneath it, a dawning, dangerous attention that felt far more perilous than death. He crouched beside her, one gloved hand stained with her blood. "Stop the bells," he said. No one moved. Lucan raised his head. The candles guttered outward as if the whole hall inhaled with him. "I said," he murmured, and the softness of it was more dreadful than a shout, "Stop the bells." The ringing ceased. In the sudden silence, Sabine heard her own heartbeat. Lucan slipped his arm beneath her shoulders and lifted her with impossible ease. The court parted at once. No one dared bar his path. His gaze remained on Sabine alone, unreadable, intent, as though he were searching her face for the answer to a question he had stopped asking centuries ago. When he reached the doors, the regent's voice cut after them. "If she survived," she said, "then by law she belongs to the keep." Lucan paused. Sabine felt the strength in him go rigid. Then he looked back over his shoulder, moonlight and wrath turning his face to carved stone. "No," he said. "That is precisely the problem." And carrying the girl no one had chosen, the vampire lord vanished into the dark. Sabine woke beneath a canopy of black lace. For several seconds, she did not know whether she was alive. The room around her was dim and vast, lit only by a low fire and a row of candles burning blue in the grate. Heavy curtains shut out the moon. The bed linen smelled faintly of cedar, old roses, and something colder beneath, snow, perhaps, or stone after rain. Then the wound at her throat throbbed, and life returned all at once. She sat up too quickly. Pain flashed down her neck and across her shoulders. A folded cloth slipped from the hollow of her throat, already marked with diluted blood. Not dead, then. The thought did not comfort her. A servant stood at the far side of the chamber, a narrow woman with iron-gray hair braided down her back. She rose from a chair at once. "Do not strain yourself, miss." Sabine gathered the blanket closer. "Where am I?" "The North Tower." The woman's voice was grave but not unkind. "The old bridal rooms." The words went through Sabine like a draft from an open crypt. She remembered the hall, the bite, the vision. She remembered Lucan Vesper lifting her as though she weighed nothing. She remembered the regent's displeasure. How long? 1 day and part of another. Sabine touched the cloth at her throat. "Why am I not dead?" The servant's expression changed in a way Sabine could not fully read, fear, pity, perhaps a little wonder. If the keep knew that answer, she said, it would be sleeping easier. She introduced herself as Briani Wren, keeper of the tower rooms. She brought broth Sabine could not quite swallow, then hot water scented with lavender and wintermint. She spoke little, yet in her quiet movements there was more gentleness than Sabine had been given in years. It made Sabine ache unexpectedly. As Briani changed the bandage, Sabine forced herself to look. The marks were unmistakable, 2 small wounds set close together beneath her ear, ringed faintly in silver-blue bruising. Beautiful in a terrible way, consecrated, claimed. Does everyone know, Sabine asked, that you lived? Briani tied the fresh cloth, every soul in the keep. The court has done nothing else but whisper. And what do they say? That you are blessed, Briani hesitated, or cursed. People are lazy with their distinctions. Sabine almost smiled, but it faded quickly. The other women, the ones before me, did they die here? Briani's hands stilled. Yes, that single word deepened the room. Sabine looked around then with new eyes, the carved wardrobe, the dressing screen embroidered with pale moons. The silver brush set upon the vanity, polished though no one used it. This had been a chamber prepared again and again for women who were never meant to leave it alive. How many? Briani stared into the basin as if the answer might be found in the water. Too many. Sabine lowered her gaze. She did not ask more. The dead deserved silence when the living had failed them so completely. That evening, rain began. It threaded down the windows in long black lines, while servants moved softly through the corridors outside. Sabine could not rest. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the vision again. Girls in veils, Lucan's face streaked with blood and horror, a silver mark burning somewhere unseen. By midnight, she had risen and crossed the room, one hand against her throat. The tower corridor beyond was empty, lit by wall sconces turned low. Somewhere below, thunder rolled over the cliffs. She should not have left the chamber. She knew that, yet grief, fear, and the strange restlessness under her skin drove her to the stair. Halfway down, voices reached her from below. She stopped in the dark. The regent will not permit it, said a man. She will permit what she cannot prevent, came Briani's sharper reply. This girl has become a danger. No, Briani said. A mirror. Sabine descended another step, careful now. A second voice sounded then, deeper, quieter, and instantly recognizable. Has she eaten? Sabine went still. Lucan. Briani answered him. A little broth, water, she is weak but not failing. He said nothing for several breaths. Sabine imagined him standing in the candlelit hall below, grave and motionless, black coat drinking the light. Her pulse stumbled. At last he spoke. The wound. Changing. Into what? Silence. Briani's answer came carefully. Into something I have not seen before. Sabine should have returned to her room then. Instead, she leaned closer to hear. A third voice, unfamiliar and male, cut in from farther off. My lord, the regent requests audience. She says the matter cannot wait until dusk tomorrow. Then she may learn patience, Lucan said. My lord, I buried the last woman they sent to me with my own hands, he replied, every word controlled with frightening precision. If the council desires another grave, they may dig it for themselves. A hush followed. Sabine's fingers tightened on the stone rail, so the grief she had seen in the vision had been real. Something inside her shifted, not trust, not yet, but a loosening of terror's first knot. If he had mourned them, then the story told about him was not the whole of it. The floorboard beneath her foot creaked, every voice below ceased. Then Lucan said, without raising his tone, Come down, Sabine. There was no use pretending. She descended the rest of the stair slowly, the banister cold beneath her hand. He stood at the foot of the steps exactly as she had imagined. Black-clad, pale, his face half in shadow, rain-dark hair falling loose at his temple, as if he had run a hand through it and forgotten. Briani stood nearby, watchful. A young steward looked troubled enough to pray. Sabine stopped 3 steps above Lucan, so they were nearly level. I did not mean to overhear, she said. You are in no condition to wander. She almost apologized, then stopped herself. I could not sleep. His gaze moved to the bandage at her throat. There was nothing heated in his expression, nothing indecent, only a concentration so severe it made her feel dangerously visible. "Pain?" he asked. "A little. You should have called for Briani. I have troubled enough people already." A strange shadow crossed his face at that. "No," he said. "You have troubled the right ones." The words entered the silence between them and stayed there. Sabine looked at him properly then. "Did you know I would live?" His answer came at once. "No, have any before me." "No," the steward muttered a prayer under his breath. Sabine swallowed. "Then why do they look at me as if I have done something wicked?" Lucan's jaw hardened. "Because the existence of a miracle embarrasses those who profit from death." Before she could ask what he meant, a bell sounded from the gatehouse below. Once, twice, urgent. The steward turned pale. "My lord, riders from the lower court." Lucan did not look away from Sabine. "At this hour, the regent's seal." Something colder than rain entered the corridor. Briani's hand tightened around the candle she held. "They came too quickly." Sabine heard the meaning under her words and felt fear bloom sharp at last. Lucan stepped toward the stairs, close enough for her to smell winter, smoke, and the faded iron scent of blood. His voice dropped. "Go back to your room, bolt the door. Admit no one unless Briani speaks first." Sabine should have obeyed without question, yet the dread in the corridor gave her courage she did not feel. "Why?" Lucan's eyes darkened, not with hunger but with certainty. "Because," he said, "the council has finally decided that surviving me is a crime." And below them, the doors of the keep began to open. The north tower was locked before dawn. Sabine heard it happen in the sounds that travel through old stone more honestly than words ever do. Boots crossing the lower halls, iron bars drawn into place. Doors opening and shutting with ceremonial care. No one came for her room. No one tried the handle. Yet the knowledge that she was being guarded, whether for safety or containment, pressed on her chest until breathing felt like disobedience. Briani brought breakfast, left untouched. Then letters, none for her. Then a dress of dark blue wool, finer than anything Sabine owned. "Am I a prisoner?" Sabine asked while Briani fastened the cuffs. Briani met her eyes in the mirror. "At Vesper Keep, miss, those are not always the unhappy ones." That was not an answer. By afternoon the rain had passed, leaving the cliffs wrapped in silver mist. Sabine expected another messenger from the regent, another decree, perhaps a priest. Instead, Briani returned with a single sentence. "His lordship asks whether you can walk." Sabine's pulse quickened in spite of herself. "Where?" "The library." The corridor beyond the tower seemed wider than she remembered, as though the keep had altered during her confinement. Servants stepped aside when Briani led her through, bowing lower than they ever had in the Ashcroft house. Some made warding signs, others looked at her with frightened fascination. No one smiled. The library lay behind a pair of carved doors near the oldest wing. Briani opened one and stood aside. "Go in," she said. "He is alone." The room was magnificent in a mournful way. Shelves rose 3 stories high, circled by iron galleries. Tall windows looked west toward the sea, where gulls wheeled against a white sky. The scent of vellum, smoke, cedar, and old velvet filled the air. A fire burned low beneath a mantel crowded with dark portraits, whose eyes seemed to watch the living resentfully. Lucan Vesper stood at a long table spread with maps and unopened letters. He did not look up at once. "Briani tells me you can keep your feet." "I can. Then sit before you prove her wrong." Sabine obeyed, more because his tone allowed no room for pride than because she wished to. A chair had been set at the table opposite his. It struck her suddenly that no one had sat there in years. Lucan came around to the other side and remained standing. "Tea," the politeness startled her. "If it is no trouble." "It is trouble," he said, "but not yours." A faint, unwilling warmth almost touched her mouth. He noticed. She was sure he noticed. Yet he gave no sign of it, only poured from the silver pot at his elbow and slid a cup toward her with careful distance. His hands were ungloved today. That detail should not have mattered. It did. His fingers were pale and elegant, marked only by a small scar over one knuckle. Human hands, if one ignored how steady they were. Sabine wrapped both of hers around the teacup for courage. "Why am I here? To ask whether you remember anything." The vision rose at once in her mind, vivid enough to turn her cold. "Yes." Lucan's expression changed almost imperceptibly. "Tell me." Sabine hesitated. She was not afraid of speaking truth. She was afraid of what truth would do once spoken aloud. "I saw women," she said at last. "Brides, I think." Not at the moment of biting, before it. They were lying on stone tables. Their mouths were dark. One had blood on her sleeve that looked wrong, thick, like ink. She swallowed. "And I saw you in a chapel. You were kneeling. You looked as though someone had laid the dead in your arms and called it law." Silence filled the room. Lucan lowered his gaze to the table. When he spoke, his voice had gone quieter. "I buried all 7. 7. Sabine's fingers tightened around the china. 7 unnamed women had passed through those bridal rooms to satisfy an old law. 7 funerals, 7 silences. "I was told," she said carefully, "that no woman survived your bite. That is what happened, but not because you wanted it." A muscle moved once along his jaw. "Want has never mattered much to Coven law." The words hovered between them, hard and old. Sabine looked at him in the firelight and felt the first dangerous stirring of pity. Not the soft pity she had been taught to despise in herself, but something sharper, a recognition of suffering so disciplined it had become architecture. "Then why continue?" His eyes lifted to hers. "Because when I refused, the council sent poorer girls in secret," he said. "Servants, debt daughters, bastards with enough blood to count and too little power to protect them. They called it mercy that their names were omitted from the record." Sabine went still. For one awful heartbeat, she saw her own reflection in that sentence. Bastard with enough blood to count and too little power to protect her. She set down her cup before it trembled from her hand. "So I was not chosen for any worth at all." Something fierce and unreadable crossed his face. No one with worth should have been chosen for this. The room grew very quiet after that. From outside came the distant cry of gulls. A log shifted in the hearth. Sabine stared at the steam curling from her tea and tried to gather herself around the wound she had not expected him to touch. "Not cruelly, worse than cruelly, truthfully." "I would like to leave," she said after a while. Lucan's answer was immediate but not harsh. "You cannot, because the council forbids it, because I do not know what surviving my bite has done to you." Sabine lifted her head. "I am not a specimen." "No," his gaze deepened. "You are the only impossible thing in this house, and impossible things tend to bleed when mishandled." She did not know what to say to that. A sound interrupted them, the faint scrape of porcelain against wood. Lucan turned sharply. Sabine followed his gaze to the tray Briani had sent earlier with a second untouched cup. She had assumed it was for him. Now, impossibly, a thin dark thread of smoke rose from it. Lucan moved faster than sight. One instant he stood across the table. The next he was at Sabine's side, one hand braced against the chair behind her, the other lifting the cup to his nose. His face altered not into savagery, but into a terrible stillness. "Do not drink anything brought to you unless Briani serves it from her own hand," he said. Sabine stared. "What is it?" "Belladonna, enough to stop a mortal heart." The breath left her. Somewhere beyond the library doors, footsteps broke into a run. Lucan set down the cup with exquisite care. "Stay here." He crossed the room in 2 strides and pulled the door wide. A maid in Ashcroft colors was already fleeing down the corridor. Lucan did not pursue her. He only said very softly, "Bring her back." The command went down the hall like a blade. Guards appeared from nowhere. Sabine rose despite herself, one hand at her throat. "She came with my aunt." "Yes. You think my family." "I think," he said, turning back toward her, "that the moment you lived. Everyone who had reason to fear the truth found reason to wish you dead." Sabine's stomach dropped. Then, before she could answer, the wound at her throat flared hot beneath the bandage. The room tilted. She saw not the library, not the fire, but a circle of elders in white iron masks, and at the center of them, Lucan kneeling while silver light was driven into his chest. A woman's voice whispered through blood and memory, "Keep him numb, and he will never choose." Sabine gasped aloud. Lucan was at her side at once. "What did you see?" Her hand closed on his sleeve without thinking. When she looked up into his face, all the candles in the room seemed to gutter lower. "The council did something to you," she whispered, "and they meant to keep doing it." After the vision in the library, Sabine could not stop shaking. Lucan had led her to a chair before the fire and knelt, not as a lord kneels, never that, but with the grave practicality of a man more concerned with steadiness than dignity. He had poured water. He had told her to breathe. He had not once touched her skin, though she had the distinct and unsettling impression that restraint cost him more than movement ever would. "What did you see?" he asked again. Sabine described it as best she could. The circle of masked elders, the silver light, the words spoken over him. "Keep him numb, and he will never choose." Lucan listened without interruption. Only his eyes changed, darkening as if memory had opened in some chamber long sealed. "At the end of the War of Veils," he said slowly, "the council demanded assurances. My house was stronger than theirs in those years. They feared what a blood alliance through marriage would make of Vesper Keep, a marriage strong enough to threaten them. Yes," Sabine drew a quiet breath. "So they made sure no marriage could happen at all." He did not deny it. The very elegance of the cruelty struck her. Not open war, not execution. A law, a ritual, a history of dead women, and a lord made monstrous by the shape of the trap laid around him. "Why not destroy them?" she asked before she could stop herself. Something like sorrow touched his mouth. "Because power rots more slowly than flesh," he said, "and because every law they wrote was inked into households who profited from it. My refusal buried girls in secret. My obedience buried them in silk." The answer followed her all day. By dusk she had returned to the tower room, yet rest would not come. The keep itself seemed to breathe around her. Old beams settling, distant doors closing, wind moving down the chimneys like whispers too tired to become words. She touched the wound at her throat and felt it answer her with a faint heat. Not pain, awareness. At twilight Briani entered carrying a folded shawl and a look both resolute and troubled. "Come with me," she said. "Where?" "To truth, if we are lucky." Briani led her through a servant's passage hidden behind the tapestry in Sabine's room. They descended a narrow stair that smelled of dust and damp stone. Emerging at last behind the chapel apse Lucan had appeared in within her vision. The chapel of Vesper Keep was small, severe, and old enough that salt had crept into the lower walls from the sea cliffs beneath it. Candles burned before a carved saint with broken hands. At the center, beneath the cracked vaulting, Lucan stood alone. He had removed his coat. For a moment, Sabine saw nothing but the impropriety of it and nearly turned away. Then she understood. His white shirt had been unlaced at the throat and opened enough to bare the upper part of his chest. Across the skin over his heart ran a silver-black mark like a sigil burned beneath flesh rather than upon it. It was intricate, beautiful, and repellent all at once, its lines too deliberate to be scar tissue. Sabine stopped breathing. "That is what I saw." Lucan looked down at the mark, not with vanity or disgust, but with the familiarity one gives an old wound. "Suppression glamour," he said, "not to weaken my body. To dull recognition, to sever instinct from choice. I could take blood, I could fulfill law. But I could not feel when the bond turned wrong until it was too late." Briani crossed herself in the old village way. Sabine stepped closer before fear could stop her. The sigil seemed almost to shift in the candlelight, silver veins pulsing faintly under his skin. "Does it hurt?" His gaze rose to hers. "Only when it remembers I exist." The answer should not have sounded so lonely. Sabine's fingers curled into the shawl. "Why show me? Because you have begun to see what my own mind was prevented from seeing." He paused. "And because if they come for you, you deserve to know why." The bluntness of it steadied her more than any gentleness could have. "Will they?" "Yes." Briani inhaled sharply, though she had likely known it already. Lucan continued, "A surviving bride proves the law was not cursed by nature, only constructed by men." There are houses that built their safety on that lie. They will not surrender it easily. Sabine thought of Lady Honoria's hand on her wrist. This one will do. Be grateful someone finally chose you. A raw shame rose in her, then something firmer beneath it. Not anger exactly. Anger was too hot. This was colder, more enduring. If I testify to what I saw, they will call it corruption, Lucan said. If you testify, they will call it vengeance. Then what remains? For the first time, a hint of something like life moved behind his austere expression. Not hope, perhaps respect. Evidence, he said. Briani went to the side chapel and returned with a small iron key. There are records in the lower archive, she said quietly. Names omitted from the public rolls. Medicines ordered to the bridal rooms, writs bearing the regent's seal. I kept copies when I could. Sabine stared. Why? Because someone ought to have remembered them properly, Briani answered. For a long moment, no one spoke. Then the bell above the chapel door rang once. A guard entered, bowed, and placed a sealed order in Lucan's hand. He read it in silence. The air around him changed. What is it? Sabine asked. He passed her the paper. The script was formal, elegant, and merciless. By decree of the Coven Council, Sabine Ashcroft shall present herself at tomorrow's assembly for examination on suspicion of witch blood, unlawful survival, and enchantment of Lord Lucan Vesper. Refusal shall be taken as confession. Sabine read the lines twice before their meaning settled coldly inside her. Witch blood, Briani whispered. Cowards! Lucan folded the decree once, neatly. As though his hands did not want to crush it. I will not send you alone. Sabine looked from the letter to his face. If I hide, they win. His eyes narrowed a fraction. This is not a game to be won by courage. No, she said, surprising herself with the steadiness of it, but it may be endured by it. The words seemed to strike somewhere deep in him. Perhaps because no one ever spoke to monsters, as if endurance were nobler than force. The chapel fell silent, except for the sea grinding faintly below the cliffs. Then Lucan stepped nearer, still leaving distance, always distance, and lowered his head enough that his voice reached only her. If they lay a hand on you in that hall, he said, the law they worship will not survive the hour. Sabine should have been frightened by the promise. Instead, with the candlelight tremoring over the mark beneath his heart, she felt the first true danger not in his violence, but in the tenderness he was trying not to show. And when she looked down again at the decree, she saw that at the bottom, beneath the regent's seal, another line had been added in fresher ink. If the girl resists, take her by dawn. Sabine did not sleep the night before the council assembly. Rain returned after midnight, striking the windows in long, uneven strokes. She sat in the chair beside the fire with Briani's shawl around her shoulders and watched the flames lower themselves into red silence. Every few minutes her hand rose to the bandage at her throat, as if the wound might vanish if she checked often enough, or speak if she listened correctly. Toward the darkest hour, Briani came without knocking. She carried a lantern in one hand and a small iron coffer in the other. Put on your shoes, she said softly. If dawn takes us, I would rather you saw this first. Sabine obeyed. The tower passage led not to the chapel above this time, but down beneath it, by a stair so narrow she had to turn sideways at one point to descend. The air cooled with every step. The lantern's light trembled over old stone, over hooks blackened by centuries of use, over carved saints whose faces had been worn down by salt and grief. At the foot of the stair stood a low chamber with a vaulted ceiling and 12 alcoves cut into the walls. Each alcove held a single plaque of dark marble. Sabine drew in breath. Names. Not titles, not houses, only names. Mara, Aline, Cecily, Agnes, Ione, Viola, Ruth, 7. Each had a date beneath it. Each date matched a year of whispered scandal, of mourning disguised as misfortune, of some nameless bride who had failed the covenant. They were kept off the public rolls, Briani said. So I gave them a place where forgetting would have to work harder. Sabine moved from plaque to plaque slowly, as though she feared the dead might wake if approached too quickly. The chamber was bare but for the lantern, the names, and a stone table in the center upon which white flowers had dried into fragile gray ghosts. On the 8th alcove, there was no plaque. Only an empty niche. Her throat tightened. Briani set the iron coffer upon the table. "I made room for you," she said, with no sentiment in the words and all the ache in the world beneath them. "I prayed I would not need it." Sabine could not answer at once. She rested her fingers against the cold edge of the unmarked alcove and stood there until she trusted her voice. "No one said them, did they?" she asked. "Not in the hall, not when they died. Not aloud. But he knew them. It was not a question." Briani looked toward the stair as if she could see through it to the chapel above. He asked every name, every time. A quiet step sounded behind them. Lucan stood in the doorway, shadowed by the stair. He had not dressed for court. He wore black as always, but without ornament, without gloves, without the armor of distance he had tried to keep between them in daylight. He looked older here, though not weaker, older as ruined castles are old, by surviving storms that should have taken them down. Sabine stepped away from the empty alcove. He came to the stone table and laid several ledgers beside the iron coffer. Their bindings were cracked, their pages smelled of herbs and mold. "These were taken from the lower archive tonight," he said. "The copies Briani kept were not enough. We will need originals before the council." Sabine looked down. Apothecary orders. Household accounts, deliveries signed under seal, belladonna, poppy syrup, white laudanum, measured in bridal portions. Her stomach turned. Briani opened the coffer and withdrew a folded sheet, yellow with age. "This was hidden in the chapel wall," she said. "I found it years ago and kept it because I thought one day the lie would become tired and fall over. It never did." Sabine unfolded the page. It was a physician's notation, brief and devastating. "Administer the calming draught before presentation. The venom takes more cleanly when the heart is slowed. If convulsions begin after the bite, report natural weakness." At the bottom sat the crest of the Coven Council. Sabine stared until the letters blurred. "They were poisoned first," she whispered. Lucan said nothing, perhaps because there was nothing left to dignify. Sabine turned another page, another order, another seal, another careful arrangement of death into ritual language. She felt the room close around her, not from fear now, but from the precise enormity of what had been done. 7 women had not died because Lucan Vesper was cursed to kill. They had died because powerful people had decided dead brides were more useful than a living bond. And she had survived because she was not meant to stand there at all. The realization struck with almost physical force. "I was not given the draft," she said. "No," Briani answered. "Your aunt changed the offering too quickly." The servants had no time. Sabine lifted her eyes to Lucan. "So if Lady Celia had gone to the hall, she would have died," he said. The plainness of it was unbearable. Sabine closed the ledger with both hands, and they would have called it fate. Lucan's face hardened, though not against her. "They have called worse things holy." For a long moment, none of them moved. Then Sabine looked again toward the 7 names in the wall, and something inside her that had bent all her life without breaking finally found its shape. "I will go to the assembly," she said. Briani's mouth tightened. "You need not prove courage to anyone here." "I am not." Sabine folded the physician's note carefully. "I am going because they made silence part of the murder. And I have been silent long enough in rooms built by other people." Lucan watched her with an unreadable stillness. "You understand," he said after a moment, "that truth does not guarantee mercy." "No," Sabine replied. "But it may deny them comfort." Something altered behind his eyes then, small, grave, unmistakable. Respect. Before either of them could speak again, a hard blow sounded above them. Then another. Briani seized the lantern. "The tower door." Lucan moved first, swift as a shadow cut loose. He reached the stair, then stopped just long enough to look back at Sabine. "Take the ledgers." The command was not cold. It was trust sharpened into urgency. They climbed into a house already waking to violence. By the time they reached the upper passage, the north corridor was full of voices, guards, servants, the harsh crack of authority misused. Lucan stepped out before Sabine could follow. "Stand where you are," he said. Lady Honoria Ashcroft stood at the far end of the hall with 4 council guards behind her. Her traveling cloak still dripped rain. She looked as immaculate and bloodless as ever, her mouth set in the same thin curve Sabine remembered from childhood disappointments. "There you are," she said. "I had hoped to take the girl before witnesses complicated matters." Sabine came out beside Lucan despite Brianni's warning glance. Lady Honoria's gaze flicked to her with irritation rather than relief. "You were told all your life not to wander where you were not wanted." Sabine held the physician's note so tightly it crackled. "You knew, my dear child, everyone knew what needed knowing." Brianni made a sound of disgust. Lucan took 1 step forward. The guards did not advance. Honoria's expression sharpened. "Do not attempt intimidation with me, Lord Vesper. This mistake should have ended in the hall. The wrong girl stood in the right place." "It is regrettable but correctable." Sabine felt the words like sleet against bare skin. "The wrong girl," she repeated. Honoria finally looked at her fully. "You were never meant for society, Sabine. No one would have missed you for long." Sabine should have broken then. Instead she felt only a cold and terrible clarity. "And my mother?" she asked. Was she regrettable too? For the first time, Honoria hesitated, only once. But Sabine saw it. The corridor seemed to tilt. "My sister," Honoria said carefully, "had an unfortunate habit of reading documents above her station." The silence after that was the kind that changes lives. Sabine's blood went to ice. Lucan's voice became very soft. "Choose your next words with unusual care." But Honoria, perhaps confident in the guards at her back, lifted her chin. If she had minded her child instead of ledgers, she might have kept both her balance and her future. Brianni gasped. Sabine could not seem to breathe. Her mother had not died of fever then. Not wholly, not cleanly. She had died because she had looked too closely at the machinery of sacrifice and been pushed from its path. Lucan's stillness changed. It did not break. It deepened into something lethal. The candles lining the corridor fluttered outward as though the keep itself recoiled. Lady Honoria's composure faltered at last. "Seize them," she snapped. The guards advanced. Lucan did not bare his teeth. He did not shout. He simply said no. And in the same instant, the first man struck the wall hard enough to crack stone. The hall erupted. As Brianni dragged Sabine backward toward the chapel door with the ledgers pressed to her chest, Sabine heard Lady Honoria cry out over the clash of steel. "You were never meant to live." "Girl," then Lucan's voice cut through the violence like a blade drawn in darkness. "She was," and before Sabine could see whether blood or law prevailed, the bells for council assembly began to ring. The hall of red glass looked different in daylight, less like a place of ceremony. More like a wound kept polished. Sabine entered between Brianni and 2 Vesper guards, the stolen ledgers hidden beneath her cloak. The blood-red moon was gone. In its place, morning light passed through the stained windows and laid bars of pale crimson over the floor. The court had gathered early. Noble houses filled the benches. Council elders stood upon the dais in robes the color of frost and ash. At their center, the High Regent waited with her white iron staff. Lucan came separately. He wore black again, though the collar of his coat could not fully hide the faint silver burn beginning to show at his throat and chest. Sabine noticed at once how the room changed when he entered. Conversation ceased not out of reverence, but calculation. They were measuring how much of him remained under law and how much had slipped beyond it. His gaze found Sabine before he reached his place. Only for a moment, yet in that moment she understood the command inside it, endure. The regent struck her staff. "Sabine Ashcroft," she said, "you stand accused of unlawful survival, enchantment of a noble lord, and corruption of covenant order." The hall murmured. Sabine felt every eye turn toward her, as if she were some rare disease upon display. She could have denied the charges. She could have begged. Instead she stepped forward and said, as steadily as she could, "I stand alive. The rest belongs to your fear, not my conduct." A sharper murmur followed that. The regent's mouth thinned. "Pride is an unattractive habit in the powerless." Sabine did not answer. The regent shifted her attention to Lucan. Lord Vesper, have you anything to say regarding this girl's interference in sacred law? Lucan's voice carried easily through the chamber. She interfered only by surviving what you arranged. The words landed like thrown glass. Several elders moved at once. The regent's staff struck stone. Take care, she said. No, Lucan replied. You have mistaken my patience for agreement for too many years. Briani stepped forward before the court could recover. Then let patience end properly, she said, and drew the physician's note from Sabine's cloak. Sabine followed with the ledgers. What happened next was not swift, truth rarely is. It moved instead with the terrible weight of records, unfolding one by one. Briani presented the accounts of bridal drafts ordered under council seal. Sabine read, aloud the physician's instruction in a voice that shook only once, then steadied. A Vesper steward submitted delivery books from the lower kitchens. Another servant identified the silver tray customarily used to carry the pre-ritual wine. At each piece of evidence, the hall grew quieter. The regent remained composed beyond credibility. Sedatives, she said coolly, for frightened brides, hardly a revelation. Sabine lifted one of the ledgers. The dose was not calming. You read as poorly as your mother judged stairs. Lucan moved, not toward the dais, toward Sabine, just one step enough that every guard in the hall tensed. The regent saw it and smiled for the first time. There, she said softly, the beast stirs when she is pricked. How touching. A man from the rear benches raised his voice. Call the apothecary. The hall turned. An elderly physician in dark brown robes was led forward between guards. His hands shook so badly he nearly dropped the satchel he carried. Sabine recognized him from nowhere and everywhere at once. One of those pale, efficient men who survive by serving power without ever being invited to dine with it. The regent regarded him with cool warning. Master Vale, you attended certain rituals. Clarify this nonsense. Master Vale swallowed. He looked at the ledgers, at Lucan, at Sabine. Then, perhaps because age had finally made cowardice too exhausting, he bowed his head. The draft was altered, he said, per order. The court inhaled as one. Altered how? Demanded an elder. Vale's voice thinned. Belladonna does not always kill at once in a mortal dose, but when mixed with vampire venom, it drives the heart into seizure. Convulsions follow, breathing fails. It can be made to resemble weakness or sacred shock. Sabine closed her eyes briefly. 7 women, not fate, procedure. The regent's gaze became white cold. You senile traitor. But Vale was already past fear. The Ashcroft household sent confirmations 3 times. The brides were to be dosed before presentation and blamed after death. A cry rose from somewhere among the benches. Sabine did not look to see whose daughter had been remembered too late. For an instant the hall blurred, and the narrative slipped, not into her mind, but into his. Lucan he had forgotten, across long obedient years, what it felt like to want violence for its own sake. Not hunger, not justice, violence. He felt it now like a second pulse. Yet the greater astonishment stood below the dais in a dark blue dress, her hands steady around a ledger. Her face pale, but unbowed, while a chamber built to erase women listened, because she refused to vanish inside it. The glamour beneath his heart had long numbed recognition, but it could not wholly blind him now. He saw what the council had feared, not witchcraft, not seduction, witness. And witness, once it endures, is harder to kill than blood. Sabine the regent raised her staff. Enough! Silver light broke from its tip and struck the floor between Sabine and Lucan with a hiss like winter water on coals. You would condemn the council on the word of servants, a failing apothecary, and a girl marked by impossible survival, the regent said. Then let the blood itself speak. 2 attendants brought forth a shallow basin of black crystal and placed it at the center of the sigil painted on the floor. The regent's gaze fixed on Sabine. If no enchantment clings to you, offer blood to the witness bowl. Briani caught Sabine's arm. No, but Sabine had already understood something the others had not. The wound at her throat was burning again, not warning, recognition. She stepped to the bowl. Lucan's voice came low and immediate. "Sabine," she looked at him. He said nothing more. Yet in his face, she saw fear unlike any he had shown in battle or accusation. The fear of a man who had watched others die, because he had not known when to stop them from standing inside danger. Still she held out her hand. A ceremonial blade was placed upon the cushion beside the basin. Sabine took it, nicked the pad of her thumb, and let one dark drop fall into the crystal. For a heartbeat, nothing happened. Then the bowl flashed silver, the whole hall dimmed. Images broke over the stained glass windows, over the marble pillars, over every face turned upward. Brides in white swallowing darkened wine, hands shaking over silver trays. Council seals stamped upon apothecary orders. Lucan bending over lifeless bodies, with grief tearing the composure from his face. The regent herself, watching from a shadowed gallery, while another girl convulsed on sacred stone. The court erupted, some shouted denial, some prayed, some wept. Lucan staggered. Sabine turned at once. The silver-black sigil beneath his coat had begun to blaze through the fabric. The regent saw it too, and triumph sharpened her features. "You fool," she hissed at Sabine. "The witness blood wakes what I buried." Lucan's hands clenched at his sides. He did not snarl. He did not feed. He only bowed his head once, as if absorbing a blow driven into the center of him. Briani cried out, "The glamour is breaking." The regent lifted her staff high. "Then bind him under trial," she commanded. "Salt and iron, take the girl as conspirator. Let the court judge whether truth is worth surviving." Guards surged from both aisles. Lucan looked up through pain so stark Sabine felt it in her own throat. "Do not run," he said. She did not know if he meant from the guards, from the court, or from him. Then chains of white iron were thrown over his shoulders, and as the hall dissolved into shouting and terror, Sabine realized the worst revelation was not that the council had murdered 7 women. It was that the thing they had buried beneath Lucan's heart was waking now, and everyone in the chamber was afraid it might choose her. They confined Sabine in a room with no mirrors. It was not the North Tower chamber, nor any bridal room, but a former guest chamber deep in the east wing, where the windows were too narrow for escape, and the furniture had been stripped of anything with sharp edges. The insult was almost funny. After letting her stand before a coven and call murder by its name, they feared a glass shard in her hand. Briani was forbidden to remain with her. That hurt more than the room. A pair of guards waited outside the door, not Vesper men, council men. Their silence held the particular smugness of servants who believe the side paying them cannot possibly lose. Sabine sat on the edge of the bed and tried not to think of Lucan beneath salt and iron. She failed immediately. The court had taken him below the chapel to the old judgment crypt. Briani had whispered as much while they were separated, where rebellious vampires had once been chained until law bled obedience back. Into them. Sabine could not stop imagining the silver-black sigil under his heart burning hotter with every moment, the old glamour tearing as it broke. At dusk the door opened. Lady Honoria entered alone. Sabine rose at once, though the movement made her dizzy. Her aunt removed her gloves finger by finger, as if calling on a condemned girl required careful manners. "How like your mother," she said, taking in Sabine's pale face and lifted chin. "Quiet until the one moment's silence would have saved you." Sabine did not offer her a chair. "What do you want?" "To offer mercy." "From you," Honoria's mouth tightened. "Do not mistake unpleasantness for powerlessness. The council may still spare you if you say Lord Vesper bewitched you. That he fed you blood in secret, that the visions were planted. Girls have been forgiven for weaker lies." Sabine looked at her for a long moment. Then she said, "Did you kill my mother?" Honoria sighed, almost impatiently. "Your mother killed herself the day she decided truth mattered more than prudence. That is not an answer. It is the only one you deserve." Sabine's hands shook once and went still. "She found the ledgers. She found a way to make herself troublesome," Honoria corrected. She had already ruined her chances, birthing a child without protection. Then she began copying records, asking questions, forgetting who gave her shelter. Her eyes hardened. I warned her not to carry papers down the north stair in the rain. The room seemed to narrow to the shape of Sabine's pulse. You pushed her. I did not catch her. The precision of the cruelty was almost worse than confession. Sabine thought, with strange clarity, that there could be no justice large enough for women like Honoria. Only exposure. Only the end of the rooms in which they had always thrived. Honoria stepped closer. Listen to me carefully. Lord Vesper cannot survive what breaks in him. The council knows it. When the glamour tears, hunger follows. And when hunger follows, he will kill. If you bind yourself to his innocence, you will be buried beside him with all the others whose names no one says. Sabine lifted her head. They have names now. For the first time, true irritation cracked Honoria's composure. What are names against power? Sabine answered softly. What is power once named correctly? Honoria slapped her. The blow rang through the room. Sabine stumbled but did not fall. Her cheek burned. Her eyes watered. Yet what rose in her then was not humiliation, only the cold certainty that her aunt had already begun to lose. The door opened before Honoria could strike again. Briani stood there with 2 Vesper guards behind her, and murder in her expression. My lady, Briani said to Honoria, each word clean as a knife, the assembly resumes. Honoria replaced her glove and smiled thinly. Then let us see how long courage outlives blood. She left. Briani crossed to Sabine at once, touching her face with careful fingers. Can you stand? Yes, that is sufficient. We have very little time. On the walk back to the hall, Briani spoke in fragments. The court had demanded a formal trial. The regent intended to sentence Lucan at dawn. But before sentence, she meant to prove the necessity of the law by staging one final presentation. Lady Celia Ashcroft, brought forward as the proper bride that should have stood in Sabine's place. Sabine stopped dead in the corridor. No, Briani gripped her arm, I know, she will die. Unless the hall refuses to let them proceed, unless the witnesses break. Unless, Sabine had already started walking again. When they entered the hall of red glass, chaos had settled into a more dangerous shape, order. The benches were full. The council stood ready. At the center of the floor, within a ring of white salt, Lucan knelt in chains. Sabine's breath caught. Salt had been cast over his shoulders and around his boots. White iron bound his wrists behind him and crossed his chest beneath the coat they had forced back onto him. Yet even bowed under restraint, he looked less like a captive than a storm temporarily given a shape. His face lifted when Sabine came in. The dark gaze that found her was lucid. That frightened her more than frenzy would have. Lady Celia stood near the dais in a gown of trembling pearl, weeping quietly into her hands. The regent raised her staff. The court will now witness what happens when order is obeyed and corruption removed. Sabine did not wait for permission. No, the single word cut across the chamber. She went to the center aisle, every eye following. You mean to kill another woman to defend the lie that killed the first 7, she said. Do it if you must. But do not call it law while you do it. The hall stirred. An elder snapped. You presume. Sabine turned on him with more sorrow than anger. I presume only that the dead deserved better than your vocabulary. Then, before fear could stop her, she began to speak the names from the chapel wall. Mara, she said. Elin, Cecily, Agnes, Ione. Viola, Ruth. Each name fell into the hall like a bell struck once. Lucan closed his eyes. Celia began to sob outright. The regent's staff cracked against stone. Silence her, guards moved. And from the great doors at the back of the hall came the thunder of something heavier than men. The doors burst inward, not council guards, hunters. They wore dark leather crossed with silver chains, their faces masked against venom, their weapons bright with consecrated steel. They had not come to preserve law. They had come to erase scandal in blood. The first arrow flew before anyone understood. Sabine saw the silver tip too late. Lucan saw it at once. He rose against chains, salt, and iron with a violence that shattered the ring at his knees. The arrow meant for his heart struck Sabine instead. And as pain tore white fire through her side, she heard the whole hall break into screams around the sound of Lucan's chains giving way. Pain arrived without shape. First impact, then cold. Then a spreading heat so sharp it felt clean. Sabine did not remember falling, only the floor rising hard beneath her and the sight of the stained glass ceiling turning above her in fragments of red and gold. Voices crashed around her. Steel rang. Someone screamed her name, Briani perhaps, or perhaps Lucan. It was difficult to tell because the next sound shattered everything else. A roar, not animal, not wholly human. A sound dragged out of centuries of restraint and grief and fury all at once. Then Lucan was there. She did not see how he crossed the hall. One moment hunters swarmed the center like ants over sacrificial bread. The next, his arm was beneath her shoulders, lifting her from the floor while silver chains hung broken from one wrist. Blood had reached the corner of his mouth. Not hers, not yet, but someone's. His eyes were darker than she had ever seen them, lit at the center by a dreadful, lucid hunger that terrified the hall and, strangely, not her. "Stay awake," he said. She tried to answer. Only air came. The silver bolt had gone into her side, below the ribs, not deep enough to kill at once, deep enough to promise it. Lucan carried her through a hall gone to ruin. Hunters and guards clashed beneath the red glass. Nobles crawled under benches. The regent shouted orders no one obeyed quickly enough. Briani, astonishingly armed with a fallen blade, struck one masked hunter across the face and shouted something Sabine could not hear. The world lurched as Lucan turned through a side passage. Behind them came running steps, curses, the scrape of pursuit. He did not slow. He took the old servants, stare 3 steps at a time, then another passage Sabine did not know, then through a narrow iron door into an abandoned observatory high in the western tower. The room smelled of dust, sea salt, and long-dead candle wax. A cracked dome opened above them to a slice of darkening sky. Lucan laid her on an old velvet chaise gone gray with neglect. She bit back a cry as the movement jarred the wound. He dropped to one knee beside her and broke the shaft of the arrow with steady, blood-slick hands. "Do not," she whispered. "I know." His voice was all control and no comfort. That, perversely, comforted her more. He examined the silver head buried in her flesh. "It cannot remain." Sabine saw then how carefully he kept himself from touching too much of her. One hand braced near her shoulder. The other hovered above her waist, as though skin itself had become a border he would not cross without need. "Will Briani, alive? The others, I do not know." He met her gaze then, and she saw it the cost of honesty in him, not the lie of easy reassurance, the harder thing. The silver in the wound had begun to blacken the fabric around it. Lucan's face changed. "She is losing too much," came Briani's voice from the doorway. Sabine turned weakly. Briani stood there, breathing hard, one sleeve torn and bloodied, a lantern in one hand and a medical satchel in the other. "Hunted?" Lucan asked. "For now, no." "They think you fled below." Briani came to Sabine's side, glanced once at the wound, and went pale. "If I pull it, she may bleed out. If it stays, she dies slower," Lucan said. They looked at each other. There was a knowledge in that silence Sabine understood before either of them spoke it. "No," Briani said first. Lucan's jaw tightened. "There is no other remedy fast enough." Briani looked at Sabine, not him. "If he gives you his blood willingly to survive silver, the bond will deepen, not by law as they twisted it, by truth. It will join your life to his in ways we cannot entirely predict." Sabine's breath came shallow. Lucan spoke before she could. "I will not do it unless you consent." The room seemed to go still around that word. Consent. No priest had used it. No council had cared for it. No house had ever arranged itself around it where she was concerned. Pain made the edges of the room dim, but in the center remained Lucan's face, drawn, intent, terrible in its restraint. "Would it save me?" she asked. "Yes." "Would it harm you?" His pause answered enough. Sabine looked at Briani. The older woman's eyes were bright with exhaustion and fear. "It may break the last of the glamour in him. After that, what he feels will be wholly his own, and if he cannot master it, I will, Lucan said, not arrogance. Promise. Sabine turned back to him. Her voice when it came was scarcely more than breath. Then do not let me die for their version of holiness. Something in his face broke open, not savagely, quietly. Like ice giving way over dark water, Briani worked quickly after that. She pressed cloth to Sabine's mouth, told her to bite, and drew the silver head from the wound, while Lucan held her shoulders with hands that shook only once. Agony ripped through her bright enough to erase the tower, the war below, the years before this one. When she could see again, Lucan had opened his own wrist with the edge of the broken silver shaft. Blood welled dark and luminous. He brought it to her lips and waited. Sabine had never taken anything sacred before. She understood that suddenly, with terrible clarity. All her life she had received cast-offs, commands, rooms she was permitted to clean but not belong to. This was not that. This was an offering made with full knowledge of consequence. She drank. The taste was not monstrous. It was winter wine and iron, grief and thunder, old hunger held behind locked doors, and beneath all of it a sorrow so immense she almost wept into the wound. Visions came, not forced this time but opened. Lucan kneeling beside 7 dead brides, whispering apologies into cooling hands. Lucan standing before the council and swallowing obedience, because refusal would damn other girls. Lucan alone for years in rooms too quiet to survive, letting the world call him monster because arguing had buried enough women. Then came something else. Her. Small and gray, overlooked in hallways, carrying candles no one noticed had been lit by her hand. Her eyes lowered at tables where decisions were made above her head. Her loneliness, her endurance. The first moment in the hall of red glass when she had lifted her chin though she had every right to break. He had seen it. Even then, beneath the glamour, some part of him had seen it. Sabine gasped. Lucan drew his wrist back at once. Enough! But Briani, pressing bandages to Sabine's side, looked sharply between them. Seal it! Lucan went still. The sacredness of the moment deepened, almost frighteningly. He bent his head to the wound at her throat, not to take, but to touch his mouth briefly over the old bite, sealing blood to bond. The contact was gentler than prayer. Sabine's eyes closed. When she opened them, his face was very near. Near enough that she could see the strain in every line of his restraint, the astonishment in him, the terrible care. If you ask me to leave, he said, voice roughened at the edges, I will. She did not ask. He touched her face then, once, the back of his fingers against her cheek, as if confirming she was still among the living. And because the world below them was burning, and because death had stood too near to bother with cowardice now, he bent and kissed her. It was brief. Nothing taken, nothing forced. Only the first honest tenderness either of them had been granted. When he drew back, the black threads beneath the bandage at Sabine's side had already begun to fade. Briani exhaled shakily. The bond holds. Sabine looked down. Around her wrist, just visible beneath her pulse, a thin silver shadow had appeared, half of a sigil, not oppressive like his old glamour, but living and warm. Lucan saw it too. His expression changed into something like wonder and dread braided together. Outside the observatory, bells began to ring again, not for council, for execution. And Briani, turning toward the window slit with sudden horror, whispered, They are lighting the eastern pyres. By coven law, if they declare you bonded without sanction, they can condemn you both before dawn. They hid in the old astronomy wing until night fully took the sky. Below, Vesper Keep had split into factions. Through the narrow windows, Sabine saw torchlight moving across the courtyards in separate currents, council guards gathering at the eastern terraces, Vesper retainers closing the inner gates. Servants slipping along walls with the furtive courage of those who have lived too long under rule and know exactly when it begins to crack. Her wound ached, but no longer with mortal cold. Lucan's blood had closed what Silver had tried to keep open. Briani changed the bandage twice and frowned each time at how quickly the flesh beneath it mended. Not immortal, she muttered when Sabine asked what the healing meant. Not changed. Only joined enough that death now has to argue harder. Briani left after midnight to seek allies and news. The observatory grew very quiet after that. Sabine lay beneath a dusty coverlet on the chaise. Lucan remained nearby, seated in an old astronomer's chair beside the cracked brass instrument that still pointed uselessly toward the heavens. He had cleaned the blood from his hands. He had not tried to come nearer again. The distance between them was now more intimate than touch. After a long silence, Sabine said, "Did you mean it?" His gaze lifted from the window. "When you said you would leave if I asked." "Yes, even now." He was silent long enough that she feared she had wounded him merely by wondering. Then he answered, "Especially now." Sabine looked at the silver shadow around her wrist. All her life, choice had been a luxury practiced by other people in rooms where she served tea. It felt almost unreal to have it laid before her at last, not as performance but as a solemn fact. "I do not want you to leave," she said. Lucan's face did not change much. Yet the room altered around the words as if some pressure had eased in the air. "Very well," he said. It was the most careful acceptance she had ever heard. A soft knock sounded against the hidden panel near the stair. Lucan was on his feet at once, silent as drawn night. He opened it to Briani, and the young steward from before, whose name Sabine learned at last was Martin. Martin carried a cedar box bound with twine. "We found this in the North Archive," he said to Sabine, "behind the accounts from your mother's year, hidden inside the false back of a drawer." Sabine took the box with both hands. Inside lay 3 things: a ring of plain gold, a folded bundle of copied apothecary pages, and a letter sealed in faded blue wax. The seal was broken by time. The hand within was delicate and firm. "My dearest Sabine," it began, "if this reaches you, then I have either succeeded too late or failed too early." Her vision blurred at once. She read by lantern light while Briani stood respectfully aside and Lucan turned toward the window, as if privacy could still be offered even in ruin. Her mother had known, not everything but enough. She had served for 1 winter in the Household Records Office after her disgrace and discovered the repeated orders for bridal drafts. She had copied what she could and hidden the pages. She had kept Sabine quiet and unremarkable on purpose, not from shame, but from terror that notice itself was dangerous in houses where girls became useful when seen. "If I cannot keep you safe," the letter said, "then let me at least leave you this truth. Being overlooked is not proof of lesser worth. It is often how cruel people excuse their hunger. Do not believe them. If ever you are asked to vanish for the comfort of others, refuse as long as you can." Sabine lowered the page and wept without sound, not like a child, not helplessly. Tears simply came because there was finally somewhere for them to go. Briani looked away. Martin cleared his throat and said to Lucan, "There is more, my lord." He laid a vellum charter on the table. Lucan read, then passed it to Sabine. It was the original covenant writ from generations earlier, before the law had been altered after the War of Veils. The bridal rite had not been intended as execution or domination. It had been mutual recognition. If the offered bond was false, no bite was to occur. The ceremony was symbolic until freely ratified by both parties. Sabine stared at the text. "They rewrote the law." "Yes," Lucan said, "after the war. To break my house and bind other nobles to their fear." Martin swallowed. "The regent means to hold final judgment at the eastern pyres before first light, publicly. She says scandal requires purification," Briani added. "She has gathered the lesser houses by promising absolution if they witness your destruction." Sabine folded her mother's letter with reverent hands. "Then we go to the pyres before she can call herself the sun." Martin looked alarmed. "My lady, it is a trap." "Yes," Sabine said, "and so was every bridal chamber in this keep." "I am tired of meeting traps while pretending they are doors." Lucan watched her for a long moment, then quietly, "You should rest. There is no time." "There is 1 hour," he said. "Take it." The authority in his voice would once have sounded like command. Now it sounded like care too disciplined to name itself. Briani and Martin withdrew to make preparations. Silence returned. Sabine sat with the charter in one hand and her mother's letter in the other. Lucan came at last to stand beside her. He did not ask permission for touch. He offered his hand, palm upward. Sabine placed hers in it. His fingers closed carefully, as if holding a thing he feared to bruise. "I read a prayer over each grave," he said, eyes on their joined hands rather than her face. "Not because I believed prayer repaired anything, because I could not bear that their last witness should be the law that killed them." Sabine looked up. "You are not what they made of you." A shadow of pain crossed his mouth. "No. I am merely what remains." She thought of the visions in his blood, his solitude, his discipline, his old obedience dressed up as duty because the alternative had been more dead women. She thought of the kiss in the observatory, brief and grave as a vow not yet spoken. "You remain," she said softly, "someone who asked." His hand tightened once around hers. There was no answer to that, only the truth growing dangerous between them. At the door, Briani returned one last time, pale and breathless. "The eastern terraces are lit already," she said. "And the regent has ordered oil poured through the chapel crypt." Sabine rose. "Why?" Briani looked from her to Lucan. "To burn the old records," she said, "and the graves beneath them." The eastern terraces overlooked the sea. By the hour before dawn, they had been transformed into a theater of righteousness. Pyres stood in 2 rows beneath iron braziers, their wood soaked dark with oil. Council banners whipped in the salt wind. The lesser houses crowded the stone galleries above, hoods drawn tight against the cold, each face waiting to see whether fear or truth would inherit the morning. At the center of the terrace stood the High Regent beside a raised platform of white stone. Briani had named it correctly. She had made herself a son. Sabine entered from the west arch with Lucan at her side, Briani and Martin behind, and a dozen Vesper retainers fanning out in disciplined silence. A murmur rippled through the terraces. Some had expected fugitives. What came instead looked dangerously like claim. The regent smiled with controlled disdain. "How obliging," she said. "I had begun to think scandal had made you timid." Sabine did not stop walking until she stood within speaking distance of the platform. Wind pulled loose strands of hair across her cheek. The silver shadow at her wrist warmed under her pulse. "We came so the dead would not have to," she said. The regent's gaze flicked to the charter in Sabine's hand, then to the copies of ledgers carried by Martin. Annoyance sharpened into hatred. "You mistake paper for power. And you mistake survival for obedience," Sabine answered. Lucan remained silent. That silence, Sabine realized, was more unnerving to the court than any threat. He stood beside her not as an executioner, nor as a beast straining at chains, but as a witness who had finally stepped out of the role they had written for him. The regent raised her staff. "Let the court observe. The girl persists under illicit bond. The Lord has broken trial. Their continued existence mocks coven order." Sabine lifted the original charter. "The order you defend is a forgery," she said, and her voice carried farther than she knew it could. "The covenant was altered after the war. A false rite was written over the old one, and women were poisoned to sustain the lie. These are the records, these are the names." She began to speak them again. "Mara, Elin, Cecily, Agnes, Ione. Viola, Ruth." This time the wind seemed to take the names outward over the sea. A woman in the galleries began to cry, then another. The regent struck her staff hard enough to spark. "Sentiment is not law." "No," Lucan said at last, "but murder is." Every torch along the terraces shuddered. The regent lifted the white iron staff toward him. "You would accuse me after generations of obedience. I accuse the hand that made obedience useful to itself." Something in her face broke then, not composure, but patience. "Very well," she turned to the galleries. "Witness, then, why monsters must remain governed." The staff came down. Silver fire shot from its base into the stones beneath Lucan's feet. The sigil on his chest ignited through coat and shirt in one violent blaze. He staggered. Sabine reached for him instinctively, but Briani caught her wrist. "Not yet." Lucan's breath came sharply. Sabine saw the battle move through him. Hunger, memory, the last splinters of old suppression tearing loose as the regent used the remains of the glamour to turn awakening into frenzy. The court recoiled. The regent's voice rose over the wind. Look how quickly truth becomes appetite. Lucan bent, one hand braced on the stone, the other fisted at his breast, as if he would rip the burning sigil out by force alone. Dark veins rose along his throat. His eyes lifted to Sabine's face with agony so naked it nearly broke her where she stood. "Go," he said. She did not move. Sabine! The old obedience in him was dying. The new self beneath it was being born through pain. And she understood, all at once, that if the regent succeeded in making his first free feeling one of uncontrolled hunger, she would win even in defeat. She would turn his liberation into proof of his monstrosity. Lucan's hand went to the silver blade at a dead hunter's belt. Briani whispered, horrified, "What is he doing?" Sabine knew before he moved. He was choosing. Lucan drew the blade and, with a sound that would haunt stone, drove it into the burning sigil beneath his own heart. The terraces erupted. The regent screamed, "Stop him!" Too late. Silver-black light burst from his chest like a seal torn open from within. The glamour that had numbed, twisted, and buried him for generations shattered outward in a ring of cold fire. Every torch on the terrace went dark. Lucan swayed. Blood spread black over his shirt. But when he lifted his head again, the hunger in him was no longer directionless. It was mastered. Terrible, yes. Vast, but his. The regent stepped back for the first time. "You would kill yourself for her." Lucan's voice came low, raw, and wholly his own. "No," he looked at Sabine. "I would rather die free than let you name what I feel." The words struck the terraces silent. The regent, finding fear beneath her own ribs at last, thrust her staff toward Sabine instead. Silver flame leapt for her throat. Briani shouted. Martin moved too late, but Lucan crossed the distance between one heartbeat and the next. He caught the staff with his bare hand. Flesh burned. Smoke rose. Still he held it. Sabine saw pain tear through him, saw dawn begin to pale the horizon beyond the sea, saw the first clean light of morning reach the edge of the terrace stones. The regent tried to wrench the staff back. "You cannot stand in dawn with that wound." "Perhaps not," he said. Then he broke the staff in half. The sound cracked across the keep like judgment. Power recoiled through the terraces. The pyres, overfed with oil and sanctimony, caught all at once. Flame ran up their sides in sheets. Nobles cried out and scattered. Council elders fell to their knees or fled. The regent stumbled backward toward the platform edge, her authority finally visible for what it had always been, performance lit from below. Sabine climbed the platform steps and faced her. No blade in hand, no scream, only truth. "My mother," she said, "read what you wrote." The regent looked from Sabine to the burning pyres, to Lucan standing bloodied in the dawn's first ash-gray light, and understood too late that history had stopped obeying her. "She should have looked away," the regent whispered. Sabine answered, "So should you." The platform stone beneath the regent cracked where the broken staff had spilled its force. She slipped, caught the edge once, and for a second looked almost human in her terror. No one moved to save her. She fell into the burning scaffold below. The cry did not last long. Then dawn cleared the horizon. Light touched Lucan full across the face. He had only time to turn toward Sabine before his knees gave way. She reached him as he fell. He was not ash, not yet. But the wound in his chest bled dark and relentless through dawn light no vampire should have endured. His hand found hers once. The silver shadow at her wrist blazed in answer. And as the first true morning in years opened over Vesper Keep, Lucan Vesper closed his eyes in Sabine's arms. For 3 days Lucan did not wake. The keep did not know what to call those days. Not morning, because he was not declared dead. Not victory, because too much had burned for triumph to sit cleanly anywhere. The council had broken with the regent's fall. Some elders fled before noon. Others were seized by lesser houses eager to prove they had always doubted. Records were dragged from hidden chambers. Names were restored. The eastern pyres were dismantled stone by stone. Still, the center of everything remained a chamber below the chapel where dawn did not reach. Sabine sat there beside Lucan's resting place and counted time by candles. He lay not in a coffin, but upon a carved stone bier older than the altered covenant, in the same crypt where judgment had once chained him. Briani had ordered the salt scrubbed from the floor. Fresh linen had been laid beneath his head. The wound in his chest had closed enough to stop bleeding, but no farther. It remained a dark seam over the place where the sigil had been destroyed. Without the glamour, he should have healed or died. Instead, he hovered in some severe country between. "The bond keeps him," Briani said on the second day, setting broth beside Sabine that went untouched. "But it cannot command him to return. That part is his." Sabine ran her fingers over the plain gold ring her mother had left behind. She wore it now on a chain at her throat, beside the scar of Lucan's bite. "What if he chooses not to?" Briani looked at Lucan with old, grave affection. "Then for once in his life, it will be truly his choice." That answer hurt and comforted in equal measure. On the third night, after the house had quieted and Martin had taken the last petitions from the door, Sabine remained alone in the crypt with 7 candles lit for the 7 dead, and one beside Lucan's hand. She brought her mother's letter again, not to reread. She knew every line by heart now. Instead, she set it on the stone between them and spoke into the hush that had always belonged to graves and promises. "They have their names back," she said. Her voice sounded different here. Older, perhaps, not because suffering had ennobled it, that was a lie cruel people told to beautify survival, but because truth had finally had to live in it. Mara, Elin, Cecily, Agnes, Ione, Viola. "Ruth," she said each with care. Briani moved their plaques above the chapel where the light can reach. No more hidden walls, no more nameless alcoves. Lucan did not stir. Sabine looked at his face. Rest had gentled some of its austerity. Without the waking discipline of power, he seemed less like a lord carved from winter, and more like what he had always perhaps been beneath law and legend. A weary man asked to outlast cruelty, until he mistook endurance for all he was allowed. She folded her hands in her lap. "I do not know whether you can hear me," she said. "If you cannot, then this is selfishness, and I will endure the embarrassment alone." A small, helpless smile touched her mouth and faded. "No one chose me," she went on quietly. "Not properly. Not without wanting convenience from it. I made peace with that because it seemed smaller than hoping." The candle beside his hand gave a faint pop. Sabine drew breath. "Then you asked," silence answered, but it was no longer empty silence. It felt listening. "You asked before touching, before binding, before even staying." She swallowed. "I think there are lives built entirely on such questions, and I had never seen one until you." Her hand went to the silver shadow at her wrist. "It would be easier if you remained asleep," she admitted, looking down. "I could say noble things then. I could promise remembrance and go on as though grief were a vocation. But that is not the truth." Her voice weakened, then steadied by will alone. "The truth is that if you wake, I will choose a dangerous life, a watched life. A life tied to someone the world has feared longer than I have existed, and I am frightened." She lifted her head again. "But I am not frightened of you." Nothing in the crypt moved. Then, very slightly, Lucan's fingers twitched beside the candle. Sabine froze. For a heartbeat she thought she had imagined it. Then his hand moved again, seeking with blind weakness across the stone until she seized it with both of hers. His eyes opened. Dark, clear, alive. Relief struck her so hard it was almost pain. He looked at her first as if memory and waking were still negotiating. Then recognition settled, deep and immediate. Not glamour, not instinct dulled into ritual. Recognition. His voice, when it came, was rough with long silence. "You stayed." Sabine laughed once through sudden tears. "You make astonishment sound very ungracious." Something faintly like a smile touched him and vanished. "I have had little practice." She helped him sit, though slowly, for strength had not fully returned. He looked down at the scar on his chest where the sigil had once lived. No silver mark remained. Only healed flesh and the thin dark line where he had chosen to wound himself free. "The dawn did not kill you," Sabine said. "No." He studied her wrist, where the answering half-mark shimmered pale beneath skin. "It appears you argued." "I did." He looked around the crypt, at the candles, the letter, the grave calm chamber no longer built for punishment. When his gaze returned to her, there was something almost unreadably gentle in it. The council, broken, the law, restored. Or it will be, when the house is finished discovering conscience now that it is fashionable. A true breath of amusement escaped him then, astonished out of old sorrow. Sabine's own smile trembled. He sobered. Sabine. The way he said her name now held no title above it, no ritual beneath it, only her. I am free, he said. Which means, at last, that I may ask without law standing behind me. He lowered his eyes briefly, as though even now he would not make a demand of tenderness. Do you wish this bond to remain? Her heart beat once hard, then again. All the old rooms of her life, gray corners, lowered eyes, dutiful silences, seemed to recede like a coastline at dusk. She thought of her mother's letter, of Briani's hidden chapel, of 7 names spoken into daylight, of the first question ever offered to her like a key instead of a chain. Yes, she said. Lucan closed his eyes once, not from pain this time, but from the force of receiving something he had stopped believing the world still contained. When he opened them, he held out his hand. Then let us do it correctly. At moonrise, beneath the restored chapel, they stood alone but for Briani and Martin as witnesses. No pyres, no poison, no court. Lucan took Sabine's hand and spoke the original covenant words from the recovered charter. Let no bond be made without choice. Let no blood be taken where the soul refuses. Let witness stand where fear once stood. Then he looked at her, not as a lord to a subject, not as a predator to prey, as a man asking. Sabine gave the smallest nod. He bent and touched his mouth to hers, solemn, tender, unhurried by hunger. When he drew back, he opened the healed skin at his wrist only enough for one crimson line to rise. She drank one sacred drop, no more. Then he sealed the old wound at her throat with a final, reverent kiss. The silver mark at her wrist warmed and settled, no longer shadow but promise. Above them the chapel bells rang once. Not mourning, not judgment, only witness. And in the house where women had once been chosen to die, the girl no one had chosen became, at last, the woman he did.